Hello and welcome to this week's What Were They Thinking? As has been norm for the last few weeks, we'll begin with updates on the CCP virus. Initial findings would indicate that it has in fact not been sourced from Pangolians, which was the ongoing theory, but we don't yet know what species it could instead have come from. This has created a mysterious intermediary animal. It's been hypothesized it could have been bats, pigs, anything really. The reason there's a relatively desperate search for that intermediary animal is that it will help to guide any research into a treatment or cure. Knowing what animal in between the bat and human has certain receptors, cells, or functions might help indicate what elements of the CCP virus can be targeted most effectively. There is one caveat to this finding, and that it's coming from a Chinese study. Unfortunately, most of China's studies are being vetted by the government, and as a result, research coming from China on the CCP virus needs to be taken with a grain of salt. For example, their own studies would claim to have an incredibly low mortality rate, far more so than any other country, despite being the point of origin. The second problem with this study is that it had to compile a genome of the CCP virus from two separate animals. That is, they had to take 2 million pangolians, compile the genome, including the virus out of this, and now they've said that they don't believe that that was the intermediary animal. The coronavirus that they had isolated from these sick pangolians was just over 29,500 base pairs in length. However, the CCP virus is 30,000 base pairs. That is a very, very similar size. The genome itself had just over a 90% similarity. That, of course, doesn't mean much if you look at the full genome. What we're concerned about with this newest CCP virus is the protein spikes that allow it to infect human cells, primarily via the ACE2 receptor. This Pangolian virus version did have these, and they were the pathogenic version that we're now familiar with on a global scale. The study also posits another theory, and that is the Pangolian and bat version of the virus may have hybridized somewhere to create a chimera, and that is what is infecting humans at present. This would support some of the more outlandish theories going around about a developed bioweapon, primarily because the recombination of the two had to occur somewhere somehow. Now, it's worth noting that recombination is a naturally occurring phenomena. It does not require a bioweapons lab or any other man-made interventions to occur. Rather, it's simply something that happens with any genetic material, and all the more so in viruses. We see it on a regular basis with influenza. Next is an interesting observation on how quickly the disease spread. It's possible that much like France, America could have been infected as far back as December last year. The case came from a man in his 30s who had traveled from China, and there's a high chance that he had been carrying the disease with him. Male infections are proving to be an interesting point when it comes to the CCP virus. Primarily, why men might be more vulnerable to infection. There's a study coming out of the European Heart Journal involving 3,500 people. The ACE2 receptor is generally found in higher concentrations in men than women. This would indicate that they should have a much higher vulnerability to the virus, given that that is its primary vector of infecting cells. The ACE2 receptor is also what is being looked at for many of the pharmaceutical interventions. This would also explain some of the disparities we are seeing in trial results. And if it can be distilled down to one specific avenue of infection, it's possible that some of the methods and discoveries can be exploited to further improve our response to the CCP virus. We also have an update on last week's story about how there was a relationship between the CCP virus and a mysterious version of Kawasaki disease. In the meantime, there's been a study published on May 13th in The Lancet that found a strong association between the two. This was an event that involved children developing persistent fevers, abdominal pain, a rash, they had difficulty breathing, and had fatigue. These aren't necessarily particularly unique conditions, but it was the systemic nature of it that had doctors and researchers concerned. We've previously been rather confident that children were relatively immune to the disease, and that they may catch it, they would experience very few symptoms, but that they would then recover much quicker than an adult. That would indicate that we don't need to be as concerned. However, there has been a 30-fold increase in the incidence of the Kawasaki-like disease. That drastic rise can't be explained by anything but the presence of the CCP virus at present. It's worth being mindful of the fact that even if children are relatively immune, they can still readily catch the CCP virus. And this can be understood more easily through watching a video from Japan's public broadcasting network, NHK. Their video shows how simply catching something can be spread. This is done using a luminescent paint. The idea was to replicate the closed and confined environment of a cruise ship. 10 individuals were sent out to dine. One of them had been given the proxy disease on their hands. Within 30 minutes, everybody had made contact with the disease, and at least 3 people had it present on their face. The face being the primary method of becoming infected with the virus, given its access to the nasal cavity and then the lungs. That's a major concern and one of the ongoing problems with the CCP virus. It spreads so quickly and so effectively, and despite that, it has a relatively high mortality rate. This is why what the WHO has finally accepted, and what we've been saying for some time now, the CCP virus may be here to stay, and even with a vaccine, we may not be able to get rid of it permanently. It may very much be the new influenza, a seasonal disease that comes through, ravages the world for 6 months of the year, and then changes hemispheres. Even looking at this as a possibly able to be controlled disease, it's anticipated to take 4 to 5 years before we do achieve that control. This owes to how it's spreading and the difficulty in getting everybody vaccinated in time to be able to eventually stop its spread. There'd be a continuous rolling rate of infection and a continuous rollout of vaccinations to try and curb that infection rate. Imagine if we continuously tried to flatten the bell curve, but every year it would come back again, but at a much lower significance. This means that every year we'd have to continuously knock it down until it no longer came back. Ideally reaching somewhere where less than 10% of the world's population could be infected in any given year. The whole idea behind getting out some sort of vaccine is to let the world return to a semblance of normality. This involves lifting lockdowns and allowing people to get on with their lives. The World Health Organization, in their infinite wisdom, has issued a 3-point checklist that countries should be able to pass if they want to lift the lockdowns. This follows a number of states in America lifting their lockdown, along with Italy and a few other countries who are gradually phasing out the lockdown system so that people can begin to do what they were doing before the CCP virus breakout. Tedros, the World Health Organization's Director General, the same person who had over 1 million people petition for his resignation, has said the following: "Is the epidemic under control? Is the healthcare system able to cope with the resurgence of cases? And is the public health system able to surveil the ongoing breakout and control it in an appropriate manner?" For the most part, just about no country can tick off on these yet, the exception possibly being China, who generally make use of very authoritarian techniques in order to achieve these, and there's a great deal of questionability about how effective they have been. A safe reopening of any country and lifting of lockdowns is necessary to return to a normal life that occurred pre-CCP virus. This comes hand in hand with some of the new practices that are becoming increasingly needed. One of these is where the FDA has said that we should try and maintain social distancing from our pets. This comes on the heels of an increasing number of infections where humans have passed the disease on to their pets, and the pets then carry the disease. The general advice has been to try and keep cats from leaving the house, and to ensure dogs do not go into dog parks or engage with other animals and people. In short, they're trying to minimize the possible risks of exposure. This makes sense when you consider some of the domestic animal exposures have occurred in households where no one in the household has tested positive for the CCP virus. While the risk of transmission from domestic animals back to a human may be low, there is still a risk, and therefore it's better to take precautions than have regrets later on. In a piece of bizarre news related to the CCP virus and all the human behavior that has occurred in response to it, machine learning algorithms used by companies like Amazon, Google, and similar are struggling to interpret what humans are doing and how then to provide the best possible product suggestions, provide data to the advertising and marketing departments, and more. This stems from an interesting MIT tech report that found credit card companies weren't able to use their standard algorithms to account for the purchasing behavior of consumers. This meant that when there was an increase in demand for certain products, the algorithm was detecting it as fraud, but it was a legitimate, real purchase being made, and as a result, they've had to begin manually tweaking their algorithms to allow for the bizarre behaviors of humans. While we mentioned early on in this video that it was unlikely the Pangolian was the intermediary species between bats and humans, another study has found a highly similar coronavirus in bats to the CCP virus. The paper would indicate that it's a naturally occurring phenomena and matches with the argument that many of the conspiracy theories are wildly unfounded. For example, one of the viruses they found had a 93.3% similarity with the CCP virus, and another had 97.2%. It also had a similar spike structure, although not the same, as the amino acids that make it were different. The point behind that is that it's a naturally occurring phenomena of recombination, and worth bearing in mind when some of the more outlandish claims of a manipulated genome come into play. Going now from the unfortunate and unpleasant news of the CCP virus, we can look at something that's funny, or at least it has people laughing. Penguins in Antarctica produce so much feces that it also produces laughing gas. The king penguins emit a ridiculous amount of feces. Their feces has a significant amount of nitrogen. Nitrogen in combination with oxygen in the atmosphere produces nitrous oxide, which we better know as laughing gas. Another interesting discovery that has less to do with laughter and more to do with confusion is a jellyfish-like parasite that lacks a mitochondrial genome. The mitochondria is otherwise known as the powerhouse of the cell. It converts an energy source in combination with oxygen into ATP and similar, which then proceeds to power all the functions of the cell that need energy. The lack of a mitochondrial genome means that there is no mitochondria to be had within the cell. Therefore, the cell is not producing power in the way that we would be familiar with. That is, this bizarre organism does not require oxygen. This could be an interesting investigation if we can begin to figure out how a living organism could get by without it, and it may help us look into extraterrestrial life. In clinically relevant research, there's an implant that has been developed that would bypass the need for eyes and let blind people see, in a manner of speaking. The paper was published in Cell. It describes a device that works around the eyes and then applies information directly to the electrodes implanted in the brain, generally in the visual cortex, which then allows for the person to see. This is an essential step in developing a kind of prosthetic that could be useful for those who are blind, nearly blind, or mostly blind. Not being able to use your eyes is bad enough, but if you can work around the problems with the ocular structure itself and directly expose the brain to the necessary information, you can more or less cut out the problem. Finally, we have some astronomical news. This relates to China's rocket, which has recently crash-landed back to Earth in the proximity of Mauritania. The Chinese Long March 5B CZ-5B rocket was launched roughly 10 days ago. This launch is part of China's move towards developing a strong and successful space research field, and possibly military given the close association between Chinese research and military purposes. China dropped their 17.8-ton used rocket into the ocean, and it is one of the largest objects to fall to Earth, or at least one of the largest man-made objects to fall back to Earth. The problem with its landing is relatively simple. It passed over many major urban centers. Considering its size, that could have been a massive issue if it had not landed where it did. We mentioned the crash landing of China's rocket as it's the second part of a two-part arrangement. The other is their prototype crew cabin. The idea is that if it could successfully enter space and return, they could start looking at putting crew inside of it. The new crew cabin doubles China's capacity and allows for 6 astronauts to be sent to space. The next stages for China are to try and develop their own space station and later look at exploring the moon themselves. And that's all the news we have for this week. Thank you for watching. If you found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Please post any comments, questions, or suggestions below.